So let's review this. We're protecting our greatest economic trading partner. We're defending hundreds of thousands of Americans living in Europe, working in Europe, in uniform and out of uniform. We are protecting our food supplies. We are investing in American industry and workers. And we're updating our own military stocks. Folks, that is a win, 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 win. And you don't find too many of those in Washington. Let's get this done, because the Ukrainians are not running short of courage and fortitude. They are running short of ammunition. We can solve this. Let's put it for a vote.
Let's try that again. Good morning and welcome to the channel. I'm Brian Lusk. Thank you for joining me today. Glad to have you here. We've got a lot of stuff that's been going on over the last day and a half in Ukraine, and a lot of it's really important, along with a lot of things going on the international front. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start on a few of the less important items that are just interesting, just to kind of let people give them a minute or two to get logged in and watching the stream. And by the way, if you are just joining us, go ahead and give me a comment, letting me know you're here. And, let me know if you have any questions. I might be able to quickly research and answer for you when we get to that point. So let's go ahead and continue on here with the first, and like I said, the first of the lesser important items. We'll start with this Australian broadcasting company's documentary. They went to the front lines in Ukraine, but they did not do it on the side of the Ukrainians. They went to the Russian side instead. Here is that article I'm looking at right here. As Drew Pavlo says, one of the most shameful moments in Australian media history, our publicly funded broadcaster running wartime Russian propaganda against Ukraine on primetime Australian television. This is from what I've seen of the documentary, they do pretty much follow the Kremlin line. They definitely state several Kremlin talking points outright and uncritically from the parts I've seen. This is the type of thing that apparently the Australian broadcasting company decided to make that extra effort. Now, at the start of the war, it was easy to get access to the Ukrainian side, and so people are thinking it's so hard to get access to the Russian side. But if you're paying attention, as Dmitry at War Translated is, he states, as a purveyor of Russian channels, I can confidently say you don't need unprecedented access to their trenches to figure out the only thing they talk about is robbing, threatening, conquering, and hating absolutely anyone who doesn't share their authoritarianism. So the whole situation with this documentary seems like it was a tailor-made opportunity for Russia to work their propaganda magic with a Western broadcasting organization. And that appears to be what they managed to pull off. From Russia's side, quite the propaganda coup. Now, one of the interesting things that we find as this war has continued is many companies have pulled out of Russia at the start of this war, and they've been gradually pulling their resources and their funds out of Russia over the intervening year and a half, 2 years. Some, however, are still enjoying American burgers and sandwiches, and they particularly list the ones that have left include McDonald's, Domino's, Starbucks, KFC, Pizza Hut, the Hard Rock Cafe, and Jamie Oliver Group, all having left Russia. But there are 6 American fast food chains that have remained in Russia: Subway, Carl's Jr., Papa John's, Costa Coffee, Burger King, and TGI Fridays. Business as usual. Interesting to see. I mean, as you'll recall, McDonald's sold off their franchise to a local oligarch who took it, renamed it to Tasty, and that's it, and moved on forward using basically the same supply chains with some modifications to cover items they couldn't get in Russia, or with changes to the menu. Overall, the facilities were the same, the people were the same, the working methods were the same. The food, by and large, is pretty close to the same from everything I've seen. It's just now operating under the Tasty and Not Much namesake instead, and entirely owned by a Russian. An employee of the Russian embassy in Estonia has been declared a persona non grata and expelled from the country, according to Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna. Now, this is an interesting story because usually you don't mess with another country's diplomats. However, it's pretty clear that on the Russian side that these diplomats are also performing an intelligence function as well, acting as spies. And in fact, many of them are being expelled for activities that are not in line with their reasons for being in the country as diplomats. Moldova has likewise expelled a Russian diplomat, though in this case it's because Russia held their election procedures in Transnistria itself, setting up 6 polling places, whereas only one was authorized, and that in the capital of Moldova. So they have expelled Russia's diplomat, and we'll have to watch this one to see if anything new comes out. Russia has been gradually putting pressure on Moldova, trying to fracture it using the pro-Kremlin politicians that they have in their orbit that are in the area. One of them even visited the Kremlin recently and had a meeting with Vladimir Putin and talked about how amazing it would be to have Russia help them with their economic issues with Moldova as a whole. So that whole situation is going to bear a lot of monitoring because it is very likely that Russia is putting a lot more pressure on Moldova than we can see from the outside. Now we're getting to kind of the important stuff here. Ukraine has been watching some patterns and paying attention. They're seeing that after noting certain requests for satellite imagery of Ukraine, that the Russians are then able to target I should say, a few days to a few weeks later, Russia targets those locations. There was a whole article in The Atlantic talking about this. I am not a subscriber to The Atlantic. I can see just a little bit of the start of the article to kind of confirm the material here. The Kiev Post, however, did give us a good summary of the article in question, talking about it. Basically, they were looking at it after the strike of a military airfield in Mirhorod in the Poltava region in April 2022. A U.S. satellite company had previously received 9 separate requests for coverage of the area, and a week after the attack, another demand for imagery of the same area. There's also a similar story when Russia fired 6 cruise missiles at the Lviv State Aircraft Repair Plant in March. And then in January of this year, fresh material covering Ukraine's capital was purchased, after which there was an attack on the city and surrounding area using more than 40 cruise missiles. Now, this is imagery that's being provided by Western satellite companies. Russia's own satellite capabilities in this area pale in comparison to U.S.-based companies and other Western satellite manufacturers and satellite providers. And therefore, it is likely that they are finding ways to circumvent the requirements that this imagery not go to Russia through third parties or other methods in question. This is a big problem that Ukraine's going to have to find a way to solve. Otherwise, they're going to continue to face even more of these targeted attacks that are being targeted based on satellite imagery that's being provided by people in the United States. It's going to be an issue, and it is already an issue that they need to find a way to resolve. Let's go ahead and move on to the news out of Ukraine itself. And by the way, if you are just joining me, let me know that you're here. I'll be still watching the comments here and be glad to have you let me know that you're chiming in and let me know you're here. As a reminder, if you are a civilian in Ukraine, you're going to have to watch everything you do, especially in areas that have not been cleared and made certain that they're free of mines. An explosion killed a farmer and injured another person in Kherson and Kharkiv Oblasts. These were mines that were in their fields from everything I've seen reported, and they happened to find them and bump into them unintentionally. This is a real problem. The mining of Ukraine is going to take decades to actually resolve in the end. And there's no easy way out of it. You can't just assume a field is clear. You have to go start up from the beginning and work on it. Oh yeah, so that's what they've got to watch out for. Hi, Paul. Glad to have you here. Tasty period. Yes, you are correct. That is the correct translation. But I'd forgotten that little detail. But thank you, Paul. I appreciate that very much. And glad to have you here. Always glad to see you on board. 3 men found a fallen drone and decided they were going to take it apart themselves. And they were killed when the ordnance on the drone actually detonated. This is a real problem here. And if you see a fallen drone and you know you're in the war zone, you really don't want to mess with those things, because the odds are it's going to be a bad situation for you. Let the authorities take care of it. Get the bomb squad people out there. Let the military take care of it, because it's not worth your life to play with a couple of $dozen worth of drone pieces parts. Ukrainian authorities have uncovered nearly 400 networks helping draft evaders since the start of the war. That's people who are trying to smuggle people out and arrange to have their, any of their paperwork approved to get out of the country. Anytime there's a war with a draft involved, there are draft evaders. There were thousands of people who fled to Canada when the U.S. would go to Vietnam or Korea. And it looks like that's just going to be a continuing issue. That's one of the reasons why the U.S. went eventually with a volunteer force, is because it's not worth chasing these people down overall. However, in the case of large-scale war, there will be a draft, and there will be draft evaders, no matter what you do about it. The Ukrainian government has put out enough funding for an additional $128 million, or 5 billion hryvnias, of attack drones. They're purchasing those on the market. They're going to need as many drones as they can get. This was interesting to me. According to Ukraine's Minister of Strategic Industries, Oleksandr Kamyshin, he said that Ukraine has deployed a locally made missile with a range of more than 400 miles, or 640 kilometers. No additional details provided, no details especially on the guidance system or how precision it is. This would be interesting to find out more, but as with all things in new development, the Ukrainians likely do not want to have the details leaked to the Russians in case they can find a way to counter it in the end. Overall, though, to see Ukraine develop a locally produced 640-kilometer missile capability means that they don't have to rely on certain other international partners as much to provide the necessary hardware and equipment. 640 kilometers is more than enough to cover all of the occupied territories and to potentially strike vital targets like the Kerch Bridge, though they don't specify exactly what kind of payload can be sent that distance. If the payload's too small, it's not going to do anything to speak of to the bridge except potentially make holes in the roadbed. So it'd have to be able to deliver a large payload in order to be able to be an effective stop on things like the Kerch Bridge or other similar hard infrastructure targets. That said, even at a smaller payload with this range, that provides a lot more opportunities for them to strike Russian infrastructure that is related to the war effort. You've seen how much they've been doing to the Russian oil industry, and therefore, with their own homemade, homebrew facility to do so, and to have this kind of range in a missile format, it means that there's nobody that can stop them from using it however they feel fit in this war. Moving out of the news out of Russia. Ukraine's Minister of Strategic Industries, never mind, didn't change it yet. There we go. There was a report. Now, there's a power outage in the Kursk area, or at least there was as of yesterday. The The Russians claim the Ukrainians attempted to attack the Kurchatov nuclear power plant in the Kursk region with at least 5 drones and an S-200 missile, when they claim that everything was shot down. However, the debris managed to impact a substation, a power substation, and this provided power to several areas of Kursk with power outages there. They're working on fixing those problems in the Kursk region. Interesting. It always amazes me when Russia says, yes, we managed to stop the Ukrainian missiles from hitting their actual target that hit this other vital piece of infrastructure instead, which always puzzles me. You would think they would intercept these missiles and drones in a place that would make sure that they fall in places that are not vital infrastructure. Jeff Selden, who is a national security correspondent for Voice of America News, states that Russia's plan is to wait out Western will to support Ukraine. This coalition must not let that happen. That's, of course, according to the Joint Staff's General C.Q. Brown. What was seen on the battlefield is a series of incremental gains by the Russians. Ukraine's forces feel confident to holding the line, but they need munitions and equipment to do it. From the Institute for the Study of War, Russia continues efforts to build a coalition to counterbalance the West by pursuing bilateral relationships with Iran, North Korea, and China. They're trying to set up both a diplomatic and military capability around the biggest, I don't know any other way to say it, but the biggest problem countries in the world. North Korea, China, Iran, they want to get together and create a situation where the West is deposed from their position of leadership. And the thing is that the West, being more about liberties in many different ways, is certainly going to have a hard time of countering a coordinated effort by even these 4 powers here. From the Defense Intelligence Update of the UK, they claim that Ukraine's continued success in conducting its asymmetric maritime strike campaign has resulted in a visit by Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu to the Black Sea Fleet command post in Crimea on the 17th of March. Shoigu received updates on Ukrainian operations and discussed the performance of Russian naval assets in the region. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, he announced new measures for the Black Sea Fleet units to mitigate the threat of uncrewed aerial vehicles and uncrewed surface vehicles. Emphasis was given to the conducting of daily anti-drone preparedness exercises to enable ships' crews to quickly repel attacks during the day and at night. Shoigu also ordered additional large-caliber weapons to be fitted to unspecified assets to augment their defenses. The Russian Navy has highly likely resorted to limiting its operations to the eastern Black Sea as its losses mount and its threat perceptions increase. With Ukraine continuing to seek out opportunities to strike at distance, the Russian Ministry of Defense has been prompted to increase its efforts to preserve its fleet in the Black Sea. And there will be several things we're going to be talking about the Black Sea today that you'll find interesting. But overall, the idea here is that Russia has finally acknowledged the problem. They suck at countering drones. And if they suck at countering drones, they'll continue to lose fleet elements, both capital and smaller elements as well. The additional drills will help, assuming they actually drill productive, effective things and not just drill out something that looks good for the camera. That's one of the biggest issues that Russia continually faces, is that when they put together one of their drills, it's set up to look good for a visiting dignitary instead of provide actual skills and capabilities that they didn't have before. So it's going to depend so much on exactly how effective Russia is at actually performing the training function as opposed to just delivering this pretty picture. We'll see. Ukrainian drones talking about the oil infrastructure. This number, I believe, is now 13, not just 12. And they're talking about the amount of damage that's been done to their oil facilities In fact, let me pop ahead a little bit here. Russia has lost 600,000 barrels of daily oil refining capacity due to these drone attacks. Now, I've seen this number as high as 900,000 barrels. Either way, that is a significant amount of production capacity that Russia is no longer able to use to either deliver products for cash or fuels and oils for their military facilities. That said, Russia is going to prioritize their military over their civilian population, so we may see more lines forming at Russian gas stations. Okay, let me back up and find my place again. There we go. Russian intelligence has stated that France is preparing a contingent to send to Ukraine of about 2,000 military personnel. The statement from Narishkin says a French military unit in Ukraine will become a legitimate and priority target for the Russian armed forces. This means that the fate of all the French who have ever come to the territory of the Russian world with a sword awaits him. Shockingly, of course, according to BBC Russian, the Ministry of Defense for France stated the technique resorted to by the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service again shows how Russia systematically uses disinformation. We consider provocations of this kind irresponsible, basically outright declaring that, hey, that's a lie. However, there is something interesting I pumped into elsewhere on BBC Russian. You note that number of about 2,000 French soldiers being prepared? Well, 2,000 Nepalese were recruited by Russia to participate in the war against Ukraine. That's based on testimony from returning soldiers and data from the Russian Migration Service. It's almost like these two bits of news that were kept in disparate locations, totally unrelated. It's almost like the two were stitched together to try and create a narrative, or even perhaps twisted to create a narrative in this way. Interesting when I see a same or similar number pop up in two pieces of news, and you just kind of watch for those types of coincidences. Russia has started resorting to painting decoy submarines on the docks next to where they actually parked those submarines. The idea being to confuse drone pilots and other imagery and indicate there might be a more valuable or less valuable target there. Traditional methods of doing so. Just interesting to see that they are carrying out this additional efforts in this regard. Also indicates that they've got real concerns about Ukraine's ability to attack and destroy fleet type assets like this. Speaking of the Black Sea Fleet, Russia has almost completed the construction of a military port on the occupied Georgian territory. That's in Abkhazia. They've managed to get everything set up for a reasonable deep water facility over here to station their warships, and it's about 30 kilometers from the border of Georgian-controlled territory. They expect that this port will be used in the war against Ukraine and will become a legitimate target of Ukrainian armed forces. Similarly, the entrance to the harbor for Novorossiysk is constantly being closed with booms now. For a while, it was only closed at night. Then they started closing it at times during the day. Now it seems like they're keeping it closed unless they need to bring a ship in or out. And that seems to be happening less and less often. Let's talk elections for a few items here. At a polling station in regularly shelled Shebekino, Belgorod region, Vladimir Putin allegedly received 100% of the votes with a 100% turnout. Really? I mean, really? You're telling me that every voting age person showed up at the polls in this area and all of them voted for Putin? Similarly, a site number 37 at Volokhonovsky district also turned in 100% turnout and 100% votes. Hi, Robbie. Glad to see you as well. Glad to have you on board as always. Always appreciate you. So we've got this really interesting coincidence. However, Novaya Gazeta in Europe ran the results of the election through a mathematical method to determine whether there was a certain amount of fraud being done in it. Now, understand this is a mathematical method. I'm certain there's some error bars involved there. However, this method determines the share of drawn votes by comparing the distribution of votes for different candidates with the turnout at each individual polling station. They went through the numbers here, and they believe that instead of the 64.7 million who voted for Putin, Putin likely received around half that at 31.6 million votes. That would be, the other half would be then fraud. Interesting to see. Again, that's not proof, but it is an interesting statistical analysis. That said, how about some proof for you? This was apparently happening in St. Petersburg, Russia. A couple of people are literally stuffing the ballot box. Now, the word is that it's expected that Russia will just blame this on a Hollywood whatever. But overall, as far as I've been able to see, legitimately, this has been happening, at least to a certain extent, over in Russia. In that same vein, if you're in there in your booth and you're casting your ballot, and all of a sudden a policeman comes storming into the booth because he thinks you took a picture of your ballot and are spoiling it, even though you're supposed to have a secret vote and you're not supposed to have anybody looking at it, the policeman demanded that the man show him the paper to make sure that he hadn't spoiled it. This is the type of actions that the Russians carry out as part of their election operation. Moving on a little bit here, last night it looks like there were several explosions in Ingles, which is a city in the Saratov Oblast and also known as where the airfield where Russian bombers fly out from. They don't know exactly what happened. It's just something to keep an eye on. Interesting to see, and we want to make sure that if we get more information on this, we'll pass it on to you. Hold on just a moment for me, please. Apologies for that. I had a little bit of extra noise happening I had to deal with over here. So let's go ahead and move on to the what I call Ruski Mir for just a moment here. Let's pull this up. Attention, Alaska. Russian propagandist Kiyosyan thinks you would really like to leave the United States and join Russia, and he says that Russia would be delighted to have you. So they're watching the situation in the United States, and they're trying to agitate the situation. They've already tried to agitate the Texas separatist movement, and now they're trying to agitate an Alaska separatist movement. This is a situation to be watched for because it's clear that the Russians are working on their information operation to try and fracture the United States as well. We won't be so united if we do something like that. Now we got to move on to the international front. The Pentagon has launched a website to oversee U.S. military aid to Ukraine. Now, I pointed out a couple of weeks ago that the U.S. had already put out an auditor's report on the previous 6 months of aid to Ukraine, talking about how it was used, where it was used, any potential areas of fraud, things like that. You know, it's clear that the U.S. is overseeing this aid pretty closely here. Now they've actually launched a website, so you too could go look at what it looks like to see aid going to Ukraine. Now, of course, I have other concerns about this. You know, showing one of the downsides of being in the United States is that the Russians will see anything that we're putting out that gives visibility or accountability into this aid. However, since there are many people who are demanding additional accountability for this aid, even though there's plenty there, now you can take a look for yourself. From Politico. Sorry about that. From Politico. Now, I'm going to state something about Politico. They are a relatively significant news organization, but they are hit or miss on the facts as far as I've been able to see. So with that disclaimer, I'm going to put this up here. France is calling for a curb on Ukrainian agricultural imports, joining Poland in a push that could cost Kiev 1.2 billion euros in trade revenue. Now, that's according to Politico on March 19th. At this point, I don't have any reason to doubt it. I've just noticed that lately that they're a little bit hit or miss on their accuracy. So I want to just address that real fast. Ukraine and Estonia have begun drafting a bilateral security agreement. Ukraine's been setting up a lot of these agreements here, and they've already been a really good partner to the West in many cases. They sent troops to Iraq. They've helped out other nations. So seeing them signing these types of agreements indicates that they're really working hard to integrate with the Western world even closer. Finland pledged a 30... Let's try that again. Finland pledged an additional $36 million to the Czech-led initiative for Ukraine. This is to get more artillery shells headed from various places throughout the world and to Ukraine for their defense. EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, has said that he's proposing to use 90% of the revenue generated by Russian frozen assets to purchase weapons for Ukraine via the European Peace Facility. I believe the other 10%, there it is, it would be allocated to the EU's budget to boost Ukraine's defense industry. That'll be submitted today, and they'll be having a summit starting tomorrow, and this should be one of the items on the agenda. Talked earlier about Vladimir Putin trying to set up an alliance with China, North Korea, and Iran. Putin is going to visit China in May, and considering how rarely Putin travels out of the country, it'll be interesting to see what happens. However, they are anticipating starting some additional talks with their Chinese counterparts starting in about the May time period. Belgium unveiled a $445 million defense aid package, including 300 Iveco Lynx light tactical vehicles. Now, I think I've got somewhere in this stuff some specs and information on the Lynx. Let me see if I can find it real fast. There we go. This is what one of those looks like, a Iveco LMV, or light multi-role vehicle. It's 4x4 and is in service with several countries already. Really interesting that they're adding them here. Just they'll have a variety of things they can do with it. So really good to have that additional asset on the battlefield. They also, I believe, here we go. In fact, here's the rest of it here. The Belgians have also set up some assistance that includes 3 tripartite minesweepers. So that on top of it, the tripartite's a cute little minesweeper vessel or mine countermeasure vessel. And it's not heavily armed. It's got a 20 millimeter cannon and a couple of 50 caliber machine guns and a couple of 30 caliber machine guns. It's not exactly a war-winning asset in the sense of actually an offensive asset. This is purely for the purpose of the mine countermeasures that it does. Interesting little ship on top of everything else. Okay, back up again here. Moving forward, the majority of banks in Armenia will stop accepting credit cards that use the Russian Mir payment system at the end of the month. Armenia has been an interesting case study going on. Initially, they've got the Azerbaijan issue they're dealing with over there. They are very motivated to get people on their side, but the people who are supposed to be guaranteeing Armenia's security were the Russians. And then when Azerbaijan came marching in, well, the Russians basically just ran away. They didn't defend anything. So Armenia has been desperate to find people to get on their side. The fact that the Armenian banks are also now getting farther away from Russia, as well as Armenia itself, indicates that they're trying to look for a reliable partner in the West. U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham made a visit to Ukraine and said, if you want aid to Ukraine, you'd better start talking to American taxpayers. Ukraine's been doing that all along. The key, however, is that there are a lot of very loud voices who are opposing it. And you've got to get through those loud voices to give the fundamental case for aid to Ukraine. The opening video that I put on the intro today from Jason Crow, I believe it was, a Democrat out of Colorado, really laid it out, not in, you see, normally I put it in moral terms, as in we have promised to defend Ukraine, or at least provide for their defense in the event the Russians ever attacked and violated their borders. And that we as a nation need to keep our word and show that on the world stage, we are reliable and capable and willing to help people who are our allies. However, he put it in a different type of perspective here. I'm going to back up and I'm going to grab the rundown here. He said, we're protecting our biggest trading partner. We're defending our U.S. service members that are in Europe. We're protecting our food supply, and we're investing in U.S. workers. And as I saw another video where a person was talking with a supporter of a specific presidential candidate, and he feels he changed their mind because he expressed much the same thoughts to him and actually spelled it out for him to see how much it's in the U.S. interest for Ukraine to succeed in this. Graham went ahead to say that if President Putin is not stopped now, there will be a war between Russia and NATO. China is on track to receive a record level of Russian oil imports in the month of March. It's a huge amount, and as I recall, that's in exchange for military and monetary support. So it's clear that China is taking big advantage of Russia's desperation at this point in time. You know, good on Xi Jinping for doing so, but it's not good for the rest of the world. This is one of those things, now, according to the Wall Street Journal, and I have no reason to dispute that from a factual perspective, the Czech-led initiative to aid Ukraine with ammunition also includes some Russian allies. When I believe it was FICO or it might have been Orban were in there was in a meeting about that aid package, the Czech went very quiet about exactly where the shells were coming from. And for good reason, because the details might indicate that there is somebody that's in Russia's orbit that is willing to take the money in exchange for that ammunition. So they're being very careful about exactly saying who, but the Wall Street Journal is kind of putting it into the limelight here. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg visited Armenia on March 19th for the first time in his 10 years in office. They were talking about the importance of stability in the South Caucasus region, and this could be a really big step towards actually getting them into NATO and getting some of that assistance. The truth is, that the Armenia situation is complicated, and I want to do a little more research on that and get a little bit better feel for it. But understand that at this point, Russia has left Armenia out to dry. Australia has reported that after having been asked to do a 6-month deployment of one of their Wedgetail AWACS aircraft to monitor threats to aid supply routes, that will be coming to a close, and they will withdraw that aircraft in short order here. Politico, this is the same source I talked about earlier. Politico says the EU is secretly preparing for Ukraine to join the bloc. I didn't think that was very secret. I thought it was very clear that Ukraine was trying to join the EU bloc. But they say that Politico says that the EU doesn't talk publicly about this because of the imports and the farmers' protests. Also, it would turn out that at 44 million people, Ukraine, I think, would become the largest country in the bloc, and therefore they'd have a pretty big influence on European Parliament. Already talked about that and that and that. The German prosecutor's office has found a Bundeswehr soldier that they're accusing of espionage for Russia. I'm sharing this one mostly to show that Russia has their tentacles deep into the European Union and to the European countries, finding ways to either bribe or suborn individuals to provide intelligence to them. It's going to have to be watched carefully because that's a real concern. And the more the longer it goes before the Europeans actually address that, the easier it's going to be for Russia to take them over. The CERN International Laboratory is ending its cooperation with the Russian Federation. In theory, CERN, the Large Hadron Collider, and all their high-energy physics facilities there, if they're not working with Russia, Russia loses basically the entire field of the experimental high-energy physics for scientists in Russia. They don't have any facility to duplicate this. Now, I saw another person mention that Russia was working on their own equivalent copy of the Large Hadron Collider. There we go. But I don't have that confirmed anywhere, and I'm looking for confirmation on that. From Anton Herischenko, the European Union has faced the greatest security challenge since the Second World War. The European economy must switch to war mode, and that's according to the President of European Council, Charles Michel for La Libre. Here's a few quotes that he picked out here. If we do not provide enough aid to Ukraine to stop Russia, we will be next. We must prepare for defense and switch to war economy mode. 2 years after the war began, it is now clear that Russia will not stop in Ukraine, just as it did not stop in Crimea 10 years ago. Russia continues its destabilization tactics in Moldova, Georgia, the South Caucasus, the Western Balkans, and even further on the African continent. Russia is a serious military threat to our European continent and to global security. If we do not react appropriately at EU level, and if we do not provide enough aid to Ukraine to arrest Russia, we will be next. Then here's the one that should make U.S. blood run cold here. It is time to take responsibility for our own security. We can no longer count on others or be at the mercy of election cycles in the United States or elsewhere. And that is one of the big concerns here from a U.S. perspective. And I absolutely encourage Europe to get self-sufficient on the defense front. Just understand that means the U.S. is stepping back and is not taking the lead on that role. For those that are U.S. citizens, they might want to think about what the implications of that. Polish farmers staged a mass protest across the country, including 50 tractors and 200 protesters blocking the entrance to the capital, Warsaw. They believe 70,000 farmers will take part in the protests. Now, if they're protesting in Warsaw, doesn't that mean they're not tending to their farms? If their tractors aren't doing any of the work of tending to their farms, doesn't that mean they're losing money? Just saying. I wonder who's really agitating this. Kosovo announced a second package of military aid to Ukraine, consisting of mortar shells this time. Interesting, though, Kosovo has its own desperate needs. Serbia has just recently said that they will march into Kosovo at a time of their choosing, meaning they intend to militarily take Kosovo. And that's despite there being a UN peacekeeping force there that's supposed to prevent that from happening. Even so, even though Kosovo is not directly recognized by Ukraine as a country, they're still digging deep to provide something for Ukraine to be able to kick back Russia. Interesting to watch. People who know which side their bread is buttered on. Let's go ahead and move forward with the front lines. Not a lot of changes here, though there are a couple. One of the things I bumped into was this discussion, I should say, about the sudden change in the ratio of Russian equipment losses, ratio of Russian to Ukrainian. Typically, this is run about 1.87 to 1 to 1.87. The monthly ratio has varied around that, but not by much, until this month, where it shot up to 1.349. 1 to 3.49. Way above its normal range. They're not sure exactly why, and I'm just going to add a word of caution here. This is statistics, and it could be to a certain extent that we're just seeing more pictures of Russian losses than we are of Ukrainian, depending on the situation. That could be an OPSEC thing from Russia's side. It could be that the Ukrainians are better about getting the information out there, and they've had a notable improvement. But overall, this is interesting to watch. And I hate to use that word constantly because I am so far from the front lines and so far from the war itself, I can't really give more context than that. However, he did look at these losses and said there was a surprising drop in T-80s, which is less than any month since April. And new T-90s have gone up a little bit, and very old T-62 and T-55s are above average, but not dramatically. So the overall the overall increase in this is statistically significant. Obviously, the question is why. So we're left to wonder. The deep state map doesn't show any significant changes. It just says the front line has been clarified. However, Null Reports has reported that the Avdiivka to Berdichi area here, the Russians have managed to advance towards the central part of Berdichi and took over control of some of the fields east of Semenivka. You can see those areas in this darker red. In that same vein, the Russian presence east of Pervomaysk has been confirmed. This is not a new change. It was previously in the gray zone, but they had not seen any actual Russian presence there. Now there's indications of a Russian presence in this area, which is basically open field and tree lines. So there you go. That's the front lines. The big news, though, is the stuff going on over in Russia itself. From March 20th, the entry into the territory of Kozinka, Glotovo, Goripoldo, Grevoronovo, Novostrelovki, 1st and 2nd, Bezimeno will be limited, and roadblocks will be set up, according to the Belgorod region governor, which turns Belgorod, Russia, into effectively a front-line zone, with some settlements and checkpoints with military, border guards, and employees of the Russian guards now setting up these checkpoints and making it so that Russian citizens might have to pass through these checkpoints just to feed livestock or tend to crops. It tells you how serious the situation is becoming over on the Russian side. They've even announced the evacuation of around 9,000 residents from the region due to the dangerous situation they're seeing there. And that dangerous situation is, of course, anti-Kremlin militias that are fighting in Belgorod Oblast. They even claim to continue to be taking prisoners. The other day, they said they had 25. They may have increased that number. Now, this is from Supernova Plus, and he's translating somebody else's information from here. And I'm just going to read this through for you. It's not that long. I won't give the deaths overall here at the bottom. But here we go. This is from Grevoronsky district in Kozinka. As you know, fighting for this territory has been going on for a week now. The Russian armed forces are trying to drive out enemy groups that have entered there from the village. In addition to the border service of the FSB of the Russian Federation, units of the 49th Combined Arms Army are also responsible for guarding this section of the border. On March 15th, in Kozinka, a UAZ Patriot car with servicemen of the 49th Army was ambushed. The car was shot by the DRG of the so-called Russian Volunteer Corps. 2 of the men inside died on the spot. The third was wounded and captured, and has been taken to Ukraine. Now, the interesting part here they mentioned here is that the person that was captured was actually supposed to serve as part of the 32nd Engineer Regiment in Kherson. However, his father thought it was safer to transfer him to the Belgorod region, and his father happened to be the head of the Army engineering troops. So the fighting is ongoing, and the Russians are having to deal with what they thought was safe territory, all of a sudden being threatened from the Ukrainian side. Really, this just indicates that Russia really didn't take the war seriously. They thought that Ukraine would not be able to pull anything like this off. But when Ukraine put together some Russian passported and Russian citizens into these groups here, these militias, well, they weren't so limited on what they could do. They do report the destruction of ammunition warehouses in another cross-border operation, this in the village of Tyotkino. And this warehouse was full of ammunition, from what I understand. It might have even been, let me see if it's here. Nope, no, it's not the same one. Okay, just wanted to check to make sure. Anti-Putin Russian Liberation Forces also struck the Energomash factory, who produced rocket engines in Belgorod. This is ongoing, and they're attacking legitimate military targets every opportunity they can. Chechen volunteers who support Ukraine are in the government administration building of Kharkovsky Belgorod region in Russia. They show where they're at and show the inside of the building there. And now we're talking just briefly about Tasty Period. Thank you very much, Paul. They have closed their restaurants in Belgorod to ensure the safety of employees and guests. The grocery retailer of Vikusville will also turn off delivery in Belgorod. The stores will operate as normal, but they will not be delivering groceries to individual locations. So it's clear that the situation in Belgorod has become a lot more problematic for Russia than it was just a few weeks ago. And that's really everything going on in Ukraine and Russia that's really important. I've got a couple of extra items here that you might find interesting that I'm going to go ahead and go through real quick. If you have any questions, though, as I'm doing so, pipe up, comment, let me know. Also, pipe up and let me know if you're here, so I can see how many people are actually still watching here. I do see Paul and Robbie, so thank you both of you for commenting today. The Ukrainian flag is flying again over Makiivka, Donetsk region. This is basically counting coup. This is just basically giving a propaganda coup right here. A month ago, the Ukrainian flag was there. The Russians replaced it with the Russian flag, and now Ukraine has changed it back. This is just, the two are basically, I don't want to say it's necessarily pointless to do so, because this is a real morale boost for Ukraine every time they do so. But it does indicate that Russia doesn't have as much control as they think they do in these areas. The Ukrainians are very happy with the CV-90s that they've been getting. And this video, this 8-minute long video, which I'm just going to drop a link here in the comments. This video right here talks about it at length and how good they think it is. They think it's amazing from everything that we can talk about here. Interesting story from Gray Zone, Wagner affiliated account here. Recently, pilots with experience in Africa, including as part of the Wagner Group, have been receiving calls with an offer to take part in the armed conflict in Sudan as part of the Sudanese armed forces. Be careful, they say. No Russian forces are taking part in the Sudanese conflict. But according to available information, special units of the Ukrainian Main Intelligence Directorate of Ukraine are openly fighting on the side of the Sudanese armed forces, and not only, as was publicly stated by the head of the GUR, Kirill Budanov. In this regard, proposals to take part in the Sudanese conflict can now only come from Ukraine and the Ukrainian armed forces. Take care of your life and your honor. The Wagner Group is not taking part in the civil war in Sudan. It's a This one I caught my interest mainly because it shows that even in Africa, there are legitimate problems happening there for Russia. And the more Ukraine is able to complicate things for Russia, even in Africa, the more resources Russia is going to have to dedicate to try and stop that situation, and the less resources they have for the front lines. It's just interesting to see these types of operations happening. Are these legitimate calls for pilots? Are they from Ukrainians? Are they from just the Sudanese? I don't know. Interesting. From Crimean Wind, just because a point of view is widely held does not mean it is not absurd. From Bertrand Russell. This reminds me of a saying that I was taught when I was young, and that is wrong even when everyone is doing it, and right is right, even when nobody is doing it. And I just wanted to add my thought there is that there comes a time when you have to stand up for principles, even in the face of the most challenging circumstance of having everybody around you tell you it's wrong. But in the end, wrong is wrong, even when everybody is doing it, and right is right, even when nobody is doing it. Also from Crimean Wind, they got their cat picture game going today. Most give up freedom out of fear. And that's it. That is why freedom is so messy. Because at a fundamental level, freedom means accepting that there are risks that are worth taking to have your own ability to choose. There are risks that are worth your life. And if you are in fear, you don't take those risks. Freedom, in the end, is being afraid and yet being willing to do anyway. Otherwise, you are effectively a sheep that can be driven to whatever place. And that fear takes the love of freedom out of you. And we'll end off with something that's basically right out of Mission Impossible, except for with cats. I laughed so hard when I saw this. It just made gave me the big old grin seeing those cats clinging to the walls there. There's got to be some kind of material, wallpaper or something they're climbing up. But doggone it, I've seen my own cats climbing walls, climbing furniture, and just all of a sudden you look up and there's all of a sudden a cat looking you in the eye from right here. So I just thought that was fun and it was a good place to end for today. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm glad you're here, and your guys' comments make all the difference in making this a wonderful experience for all of us, even in the challenges of sharing news about the war in Ukraine. As always, I try to provide the best possible information confirmed with multiple sources, and I do tell you when there's only a single source so you know to double check things and do your own homework at times. This is important. Stopping Russia is important. Even if you have no love for Ukraine at all, if you love Europe and you love America, the truth is that if you don't stop Russia now, there will be tremendous loss of life as we have to stop them later in Paris, in Brussels, in Alaska, in Hawaii. And that is what the Ukrainians are truly fighting for. They want their freedom. They want their freedom. They may be afraid, but that doesn't stop them from acting because they love their freedom. And they know that if they don't stop Russia, then all is lost. And again, that's everything. If you enjoyed today's video, hit me with that thumbs up. Subscribe if you're new here. You have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next video.